use stories to improve our mental health and get to know ourselves better? And what do parallel universes have to do with all this? My name's Hazel Gale. I'm a former therapist turned author and creator of the fantasy mental health game Betwixt. And I'm super excited to introduce you to Rachel Noll James, who is the actor, writer, and director behind the hauntingly beautiful film Ingress.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, Hazel. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
So we're doing this little interview to explore the ways in which story of all kinds, from movie to books to games, of course, like Betwixt, can help us to improve our mental health, build self-awareness, and also improve, emotional resilience. And we also want to let you know about a free interactive workshop that we're going to be hosting on the 15th of October in the Betwixt Discord server. I'll tell you a bit more about this later, but needless to say, it's going to help you to dive even deeper into all the topics we're going to discuss today. But first of all, let me introduce you to Rachel. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and also how you came up with the idea for Ingress?
So I am a filmmaker and an actor and a storyteller, many varieties. My background is in film and TV. I spent 12 years in LA, kind of working and hustling in the entertainment industry, and found the whole structure of that system to be very constrictive to new ideas, to underrepresented voices, to things that are out of the box. And it turns out most of the things I'm interested in exploring are out of the box. And so, interestingly enough, I really started to find my groove when I moved out of LA and up to the Pacific Northwest. And that's where I conceived of my film Ingress that Hazel mentioned, which is a film about a woman who can move between parallel realities. It's shot up in this beautiful Pacific Northwest island where I live. So it's very misty and foresty. And it's really an exploration of, yes, sci-fi, yes, parallel realities, but at a deeper level, kind of an exploration of grief and loss and kind of the what ifs of life. What if I could make a different choice? And kind of playing with that quantum physics reality of, what if things here are not quite what they seem, and using that as a backdrop to explore some themes around mental health, around self-acceptance and self-doubt, diagnosis, and just some other concepts that I found really interesting to explore. And kind of in line with that, Hazel, I've been really curious to learn more about your background in terms of your origin story. You've had such a unique path, and I'm particularly interested in like all of the experiences that led up to Betwixt specifically, and why Betwixt. What was it about that kind of sparked your interest and passions?
Okay, huge question. So my background is all over the place, to be honest. I started out, like the first job I ever had was jazz singing. I was a jazz singer as a teen, in little sort of duos and trios. But I didn't really stick with that, partly because it was totally terrifying. Instead, I went off to art school. I got an art degree. And when I came out of art school, just like everybody with an art degree, I went into hospitality. And what happened there, again, art terrifying. The theme of all of this is that I had a sort of a low level, really kind of a level of self-doubt and fear that I wasn't yet able to even comprehend. I just didn't get it. But it was stopping me from doing all of these things. Eventually, I found myself, just thanks to falling in love with a guy that I worked with in a bar, I found myself following him into a kickboxing dojo and learning to fight, which is, I think you can agree, the perfect thing to do if you've got an anxiety issue. It was just, I absolutely fell in love with it immediately. Nothing happened with the guy, by the way, but that didn't matter because fighting was my new obsession. And I started competing. But because of this rumbling self-doubt and anxiety, I just completely wore myself out, physically and emotionally. I broke down, I crashed, I burnt out awfully. And it took me ages to acknowledge what was going on, and especially to acknowledge any role in it myself. For a long time, I just thought, I'm broken, poor me, I'm broken, somebody needs to fix me. And I could even remember getting annoyed with people, doctors, when they couldn't. But eventually I conceded that, I might be playing a part in this. And that, of course, took me to therapy. And really everything changed. My health got better as a result of working on the base of the roots of the fear, but also learning how to respect my boundaries and state my needs and take care of myself, the fairly obvious boring sounding stuff that totally changes your life. And ultimately, I got back into fighting, and I got back into the ring, and I had a level of, a small, not a huge level of objective success, but I had some success there that people would look at and say, wow, that's amazing. But was starting to realize that it just wasn't for me. I didn't like punching people in the face that much. In fact, I was more interested in learning how to help people. So I went and trained as a therapist, and I worked in private practice for about 10 years. I wrote a book about all of this, and eventually a writing colleague called Ellie, contacted me with the idea of creating a fantasy choose your own adventure game that would help people with their mental health. And I was just over the moon with the idea. Nothing could possibly have suited me better, coming from a super competitive gaming family anyway. And that was that. It was about 5 years ago. We've been working on it ever since.
That's so cool. And I love what you said about like the thing that seems so simple with just finally stepping back and putting yourself and your own self-care first, because I feel like that was my same. I mean, not fighting in the ring, obviously, but the lifestyle in LA was always focused all the time on like product and output and get the job and get the opportunity and hustle, hustle. And I was living in a crowded street, and it was just so stimulating when I moved up here and it was quiet and I started prioritizing myself and my health and my happiness first. Then it's like the well of creativity opened and like different opportunities started to open because I was finally focused here and not out there.
Absolutely. I mean, it completely changes everything. And it's a huge difference, but at the same time, in terms of perspective and experience, it's quite a subtle change. It's not a big thing to do, but once you achieve it, life just feels different. The way I used to describe it was that this is cliched, but it's so on the nose. It felt before, like without realizing it, that I'd been swimming upstream. And once I learned to respect myself, to operate from a place of self-compassion, it was just like I'd realized actually I was going the other direction. I turned around and flowed downstream instead, and was like, this is easier and better and more enjoyable and everything. Speaking of processes, I would like to know about the process of making. I know nothing about this. So the process of making, writing, creating a film, after that initial seed was sown, what had to happen for Ingress to actually come about?
So it's completely different for every person, obviously. But the way I kind of write, there's an amazing book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic. I don't know if you've read it. I love it. And she talks about where inspiration comes from and this idea of having a muse, or having what does she call it? I can't remember, but basically the idea that ideas come to us. It's not so much that we're generating them. And I feel like that's very much the case, especially with Ingress, because Ingress, I had no idea what this story was. I had kind of seeds of things that I was interested in, but I had this scene drop into my head one day where I pictured a little girl in a foster home sitting on a couch in like a chaotic, noisy space and feeling very overwhelmed. And the camera kind of pushes in on her and she closes her eyes. And when she opens them, she's in a different living room that's like pristine and quiet. And I was like, that's cool. What is that? And so I kind of started riffing from there. And that scene didn't actually end up making it into the movie. And the whole story kind of shifted from there. But that kind of seeded this idea of someone who could move between realities. And then the rest it kind of fills in for me like scene by scene. So I'll kind of start writing and it'll come. And then there'll be nothing. And I'll have to just kind of walk away for a while. And then something else will drop in. And a key for me, I had a playwriting teacher in college who she would talk to us about the concept of the shitty first draft and how you have to let yourself write the shitty first draft, because if you continue to self-edit as you go, you will never finish. And that has been such helpful advice for me, because as I'm writing, I'm like, oh, this is so not it. And it's so easy to stop and go back and critique, but just forcing myself to keep writing all the way to the end, because once you get all the way through it, it's like you start to see the shape of it, and then it becomes much easier to go back and edit it. So that was phase one, was the writing phase. And so I worked with that story, and all the pieces kind of came together. And once the script was done, I knew I wanted to film it up here. And so I started thinking about, okay, like what do I have at my disposal? I met with some new people I had met. I had just been here a few months, and I met with a guy who did a lot of fundraising for nonprofits on the island. And I just asked him, hey, I'm interested in raising some money to do an independent project. Do you have any advice? And he was like, hey, why don't you meet these three people? And so I had coffees with these three people. And then each of them individually would say, hey, you should meet this person. And so I had about 1,000 coffees. And it was so wonderful because not only did it ultimately yield meeting the people who brought the funding to the project, but also it just connected me in with the community in a way that I probably wouldn't have done on my own because I can be quite introverted. And so it kind of forced me out into a more extroverted version of myself. And what was so beautiful about the process with Ingress in particular is we ended up with, it was such a low budget we were working with. It was under $100,000, which for a film is like pennies. But we had so many amazing people, from crew that I knew previously in LA who came out, to people in the community who cooked meals for the crew or donated their house for a week for free and took their dogs and went and lived in an Airbnb so we could do this. Like, just such incredible love and support from the community is a huge part of what made this film happen. And for me, you know, after so many years of feeling creatively stifled, just to be able to make this project that was so uniquely mine, I was able to direct it, to act in it, to just run around and like play make believe and do all the things I wanted to do. It was just, it was so empowering and terrifying and wonderful. And yeah, like you said about the running against the current versus flowing, like it felt from day one of that thing, even though it wasn't always easy, it felt like I was flowing in my river for like the first time. And so it was a pretty incredible, incredible experience.
You have just mentioned, I mean, so all of that was totally fascinating. And in particular, because we haven't spoken about this before, but the big magic thing about the ideas coming to you is something that, I mean, I think I mentioned, I think I wrote about that in my book. I certainly have got big magic on my bibliography. I can't remember if the bit about that actually made the cut, but I found that so liberating and fascinating. So in case anybody doesn't know what we're talking about, what Gilbert says in her book, she proposes the idea that concepts, ideas, and inspiration has a life of its own, and it will visit you almost as an opportunity for you to be the person to realize it, to turn it into a reality. And if you don't go with it, she says, this idea will be like, oh, okay, you're not my guy then, and we'll go off and have somebody else do it. And she sort of mentions situations where people have actually sort of not gone with an idea and then somebody else has made it, you know, and all of that could easily be coincidence. But so it doesn't matter whether this is really true or not. The point is that when you start to think of it this way, you start to value the work so much more as a thing of its own. And once you are making a thing and your purpose feels that your job in this moment is to bring life to this idea that you think is wonderful, it starts all being about you. This connects you to something bigger. It's not, here I am with my idea, making my thing, and everyone's going to look at me and tell me how good I am as a result of making it. That's not helpful in any way. It just, no matter how much we buy into our own brilliance, that inspires anxiety. But this idea of being the conduit through which these ideas, which have their own existence in their own right, can flow, we take all that pressure off, which I just think is so valuable. And in the same vein, the shitty first draft thing, I definitely did mention this in my book, because that doesn't just apply to actual projects. Of course, that's what life is like. If we try to edit our life story and ourself as we go, making it right before we have any idea where we're going, like the type of people who really worry about being in the right career in their 20s or something like that. And I always see people, I didn't have this concern because I was too busy getting drunk in a bar. But I see people with that kind of concern. I'm like, guys, you know, in 20 years' time, you could be doing something so entirely different. And at the end of the day, whatever we do in our 20s, even if what we're doing is working in a bar and getting drunk like I was, the experiences you have at that time will inform and help you later. Like, no matter what you do, no matter how traumatic it becomes. So those two things together, I just think are the most powerful reframe in one go that we can use, really.
I completely agree. And I want to ask you a question about the writing process of Betwixt, but I just want to throw one more thing out, which this made me think of, which my mom told me, because she actually, and when she was in her 20s, wanted to be an actress. And she, as she got through her 20s into her 30s, she was very kind of like, I have no idea what I want to do, what I'm going to do with these talents and skills I've been accruing. She went to, you know, she got a degree in psychology and various things. And someone said to her, the thing you're meant to do may not exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it turned out, as she got into her 30s, like she ended up making music and recording her own album in a way that was not possible before technology started to change so that you could actually do more of that. So anyway, it's such an example of like, we just never know. We never know where our journey's taking us, even if we're like me, 100% sure all the time that we know exactly what's best for us. We really have no idea.
Exactly. One of my therapy teachers always used to say, you're not the person you're going to be yet. Whenever anyone was freaking out about anything, he would just say that. I think most people would get annoyed with it after a little while, but you can't help but stop and go, you know what, you're right. It doesn't really matter. Who knows where I'll be in 5 years' time?
Yep.
The writing process of Betwixt is like, so people who've played Betwixt, I doubt they truly understand how much work goes into writing it. I mean, with a choose your own adventure story, of course, any scene that you pass through has potentially been written in about sort of 10 or 15 different versions. So that obviously, especially as the chapters go on, means the thing just branches out into this sort of infinite sized thing. But that wasn't even, that's not even really the reason it took so long. So we started out super basic. After Ellie came with this idea, we didn't have any money at that point. I think we got one grant early on from the Paul Hamlin Foundation for innovative ideas. So it was great. And we spent that on the writer. We got a writer, not the one we ended up sticking with actually. And we wrote a story and we put it into ManyChat, which is a chatbot system, the one that you use to get your Facebook business account to automatically reply to people, right? Super, super basic. And we thought, if we can make an interactive story work in ManyChat, then we can make it work anywhere. Right? So we made this story, we wrote it out, and at the beginning we thought that people would enjoy the story, but as soon as it started to feel like therapy in any kind of way, they'd get turned off. So we tentatively put these therapy bits in. So we waited for chapters and chapters before it really got to the therapy part, and then we tested it. And what we found was the absolute opposite was true. So people, sure, they liked the story, but the point at which they really bought into it and thought this is, something worth doing was when they'd been asked a personal question and they got to type in their own personal answer or describe their version of the world through the lens of whatever they were focusing on, because that was the point at which it became theirs. And so this was a really defining moment. This is when we thought, okay, this, not only can we make this work, but actually this thing that everyone's been telling us isn't going to work is actually on its own is a new thing that people really, really feel like they need, or at least the people who tested with. So from that point forward, I mean, then it's about 2 or 3 years before the story was written. Like this was all 5 years ago that we started it. Then we went into full-blown story writing mode went through 3 different writers until we've settled on Natalia Theodorodou, who is known as Nassos to his friends, and he is amazing. And he wrote the story with us. I could go on for ages about this. I won't. The game launched just over a year ago, and at first we were so nervous. I was anyway. I don't know if Ellie was. I was so nervous because even though, and again, this kind of links back to the shitty first draft thing, even though all the way through this, I've been so in it and so inspired and certain that we were doing something good, every time it went out for a new phase of testing or a launch, I would convince myself that this would be the time everyone would be like, what the hell are you doing? This is rubbish. But that didn't happen. We've had, the feedback is incredible. We've had over 400,000 downloads now, which is something I had no idea we were going to achieve. So honestly, I couldn't be happier.
It's so amazing. And what I find so impressive about game writing, having never done it myself, is like, when I'm writing a screenplay, it's like there's one linear story. And writing for a game, it is like parallel realities, right? Because it's like you have to interact with a moment and then think, what are all the possible ways I could interact with this moment? And then you have to write each of those spider webs, and I think about this on the Betwixt level, and then I think about this on the level of, say, a game like Fallout or something where it's open world and every character you talk to, it's just like, it's insane.
Yeah, and throw into that the fact that players are going to be entering real life stuff about their world in the text. which the game feeds it back. You don't just write in and then it disappears. We take it and we swap. This is one of my favorite things we worked out to do. It's very simple. We swap the pronouns, meaning that if somebody writes, I like cats, we can apply a function that changes I to you and we to you, and your mine to yours. So somebody writes, I like cats, I think they're great. And we can change that into, you like cats, you think they're great, which means that we can then take the things. I mean, in therapy, we do a lot of repeating anyway. The therapists will repeat back what somebody said to them to help them to take a perspective on it. And this, we get to do in the game in this way, which on its own, another one little thing, we did it because we had to make the story work. But as soon as it was actually happening, we're like, oh, this on its own is really important, because it gives people an opportunity to have reflected back to them their perspective on the world and the way that they are making their conclusions. And that in itself can be really eye-opening, especially when you read back a while later.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
I would like to talk about the themes of the movie of Ingress, because really you touch on a number of my absolute favorites. The big thing, and we've mentioned this a number of times already, is parallel universes or many worlds theory. I think most people know what this means, but just in case, many worlds theory is an interpretation, a theory from quantum mechanics that explores the idea that there are infinite universes out there in which every decision that could possibly have been made, every outcome that could possibly have been achieved, does exist. And the reason I find this so fascinating is that it's used quite often in therapy. So it's used in CBT as a metaphor to help us to grasp the fact that we have these versions of the future ahead of us, and the one that we get is dependent on the decision that we make in the present. It's used in narrative therapy to explore various different storylines that could exist or do exist in our lives. I've used it time and time again as a way of visualizing the future, or a future, trying things out, basically. It's a form of self-distancing. So self-distancing is a really powerful of tool for emotion regulation, which simply demands that we take a step back from our life to view with a little objectivity. And a great way of doing this is to view a parallel self, view a version of yourself in a different universe. But most beautifully and most poignantly, in terms of this conversation, many worlds theory can be used as a form of cognitive reframing that helps therapy clients to deal better and cope better with uncertainty and regret. Because by exploring the idea that every version of every decision that we've made is actually out there somewhere, we can somehow lessen the weight of regret and make decision-making a little easier. And I just think that's magic and beautiful. And it's relevant here because, of course, Ingress deals with the topics of grief and loss and the regret that comes with all of that. So I'd love to hear from you a bit more about what you wanted to use that theory for, what you hoped the viewers would be able to get out of the many worlds construct in your movie.
There was a seed in there. It's exactly what you said, right? Like all these decisions, all these choice points. So in the story of Ingress, the main character, Riley, her husband dies very suddenly. And that kind of, sudden, the loss of the what could be, and the sense of, continuing to see and hear and engage with the people who we've lost, even after they're gone, I think is a very universally experienced thing. It's reckoning with loss is a very difficult part of the human experience. And this story, this concept of someone who could, what if you were able to shift between those parallel versions of your life? And to take it a step further, the seed that was planted in my head by a conversation early on with someone was, what if we are moving between different versions of our life all the time and we just don't realize it? Right? Because the thing is the present moment is all that really exists. We can only tangibly prove, like sitting in our collective houses right now, like I can look around the room, this is real, I can touch things. Outside of this room, I can't actually prove in this moment that anything else exists. And so this concept of reality is the present moment, memory is what tells us there's a continuity to a past, the future is a story. So if the only thing stitching us to a continuous timeline is memories, what if memories are something that fill in? And so for all I know, yesterday I was living somewhere completely different, having a completely different experience, but I woke up this morning here in this life, and the memories filled in to make me feel like I'd always been here. And so that conversation kind of seeded this whole concept of like, okay, well, what if that was just your life, but you had some awareness that it was happening? And I started thinking about experiences in my own life that, like those, I'll have moments where I'm just sitting here and all of a sudden my ear will start to ring. It's like, what is that about? Or I'll suddenly get those floaters in my vision, or I'll be walking down the street and I'll see a house. I mean, it's a street I've been down 1,000 times. I look at this house and it's like, I swear I've never seen that house before. And then our brains very quickly are like, of course you have, you just weren't paying attention. But just again, I started to ask myself, okay, probably, but what if truly that house was not there yesterday and I just shifted somewhere else and I didn't even realize it? And what I like about that game is, no, I can't prove it, but it's fun. It's fun to think about. And that's what I love about quantum physics is it opens up just a big cosmic what if, where it's like, we don't actually know what's going on. So if we don't know what's going on, that means anything's possible. And if anything's possible, then what kind of fun can we have in exploring that? And that's kind of where, the seed of Ingress came from. And then it kind of, going back to Elizabeth Gilbert, it's like, people ask me all the time, after screenings and stuff, like, where did this idea come from? And I've watched this movie hundreds of times now. And sometimes I watch it and I'm like, where did that come from? Like, I don't even know how I came up with those, because I don't think that I did. It's like it kind of came through, but the way it all stitched together and the way the characters flowed in and out and the conversations, and it ended up becoming a very poignant exploration of kind of mental, like those, mental health, panic attacks, grief and loss. You know, I've had people tell me that the way I portrayed, Riley shifting through realities felt very tangibly similar to them, to their own personal experience of having a panic attack or having an oral migraine. So there's this relatability that came through that I never expected, kind of like you said with Betwixt. I thought people would watch this and be like, you're so weird. This is so weird. And instead people are going, oh, you saw a little bit of me and I'm seeing a little bit of you. And their experiences of this are so vastly different from each other, but they're all so personal. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about art. And if you're willing to show up vulnerably and just trust that dance with the muses or whatever and put it out, like, it's incredible the kinds of connections that can come from it.
I love it. I'm just sitting here nodding and nodding and nodding and nodding. I mean, there's so much in there to unpack. One thing that really jumped out, well, no, two things that really jumped out when you said that. One is that memory does fill in, right? We know this from studies. We know that memory is not reliable. There's one study, I've talked about this many times, one study that took a group of people that had witnessed the Challenger space shuttle exploding. And when that happened, they happened to be doing a study already on flashbulb memories. They'd probably been sitting around waiting for a disaster. Anyway, the Challenger space shuttle exploded and they went out and talked to a bunch of people the day after the event, and they collected a list of details, some of which were kind of subjective, how did you feel, what was your take on it, and others that were quite objective. Where were you, what time of day? No, they would have known the time of day. Where were you? Who were you with? What did other people say, etc., etc. Then they came back 2 years later to those same people to check how much they've got right, and not a single person gave the same answers as before. Not a single person got them all right. But even more frightening than that, a quarter of those people got every answer, said something completely different in every single answer. So we are making stuff up, even with flashbulb memories, which feel like flashbulb moments, stepping into a replica of the situation. Even with those memories, they are not reliable. So this is enormously important in terms of how we define ourselves by stuff that's happened in the past, which we all do without realizing it a lot of the time, and sometimes because we do realize that. None of the stuff that happened in our childhood necessarily happened. It isn't necessarily there. And the other thing that came to mind is that this idea of emotions allowing us to step into different realities is also kind of true, right? So, and it links with the memory thing. Memory is state dependent. So if you take somebody in a wonderful mood, like if you go to a party with someone, let's say you and I decided tonight to go to a party, And then over the coming years, you asked me about that party when I was in a great mood. First of all, I would remember the good stuff about it. I'd be like, yeah, that party, oh my God, remember that guy? He was hilarious. And the more I told these stories about the funny party it was, probably the more amazing and wonderful my memory of this party would become. But if instead you decided to ask me about that party when I was feeling really low or really anxious, the things I would remember about it would be the bad bits. Oh yeah, it was all right party, but I felt a bit nervous about myself. And you know, that conversation with that guy, I didn't really feel like I was being myself at that moment. And the more you asked me about it when I was in that state, the more oppressive and difficult and uncomfortable that memory would become. It can mutate into a version of itself depending on the emotions that I'm feeling whenever I remember it. So we have like these tunnels that we can step into. We have an anxiety tunnel, which at any point we can step into. And where we are, we'll remember all the things connected to that emotion, all the times in our life when we've made a fool of ourselves or felt rejected or whatever it is that is fueling our fear becomes instantly available because our mind does this to survive, right? If I'm in an anxious state, I need to remember everything about anything that's ever made me anxious so I can survive whatever this threat is. But of course, that's not what happens. What happens is I just get more anxious, which usually, in modern life, means that I do worse. So we can step into a different place. This reminds me, once I had a conversation with a therapy client, I explained all of this, and we were talking about love. She was saying that she wanted more love in her life, and I was talking about anxiety tunnels. And then I said, with all complete seriousness, you just need to spend a bit more time in your love tunnel. Thankfully, she had a sense of humor. She was like, yeah, sure, we can all do a bit of that. And I was like, oh no, this is awful. That's obviously not what I meant. Anyway, that was a tangent that probably didn't need to be talked about, but that's always what I think about when I go to tunnels and realities.
So in thinking about parallel realities, and again, bringing it back to Betwixt for a moment, I feel very strongly that, Betwixt is a parallel reality. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about, setting this story in this kind of alternate parallel universe in the way that you did, and how that ties into, why you felt that would be a helpful setting.
So a lot of it, again, just as you were saying earlier on, a lot of it came about kind of organically, and I don't know, some of it wasn't premeditated, but some of it was. So the idea with the in-between was that it would be a kind of, yes, a parallel universe, but in particular, a parallel universe where we are really connected to our experience. So it's kind of a liminal space. We don't, it's not meant to represent any particular situation other than the fact that you are inwardly focused and also connected to your true self, if you like, or your sort of your deeper self, and the world in a different way. So I love this idea that you can step into these places where you can access, archetypal energies and sort of fundamental resonant truths about being human, which all sounds very big, but we're doing it all the time. Every time a story touches on the archetypal, it lights up this sort of sense of trueness in us, even with the most cliched story in the world, which is actually often the case with archetypal stories. That thing, something about them just clicks into place, and those things help us to make sense of ourselves. And so knowing that this was happening in books and movies anyway, and has been, ever since we've been able to communicate, because we have been learning through story since the very earliest days of our, evolution as a species. Since I knew this was happening anyway, I wanted to see if we could take it into a place where we could actually harness it and use it on purpose, this liminal parallel world, where we set up the possibility of knowing ourselves fully and making conscious choices, which is kind of magic, right? To make actually a conscious, intentional decision about who we are and what we're about to do and what we're about to say, as opposed to just being yanked around and pulled through life by, expectations and habit and emotions. Yes, so that was where it all came from.
I love that. And the last thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking before as well is, something that definitely I was exploring in Ingress is the symptom, or the anxiety, the panic, the stress, the sort of unpleasant feelings that arise are generally in response to resistance to what is happening. And so the character in Ingress, she starts to feel the slip happening where she feels herself moving somewhere else and she resists. And it's the resistance that creates the panic and the stress. And the whole message of the film is really, dealing with that balance of let go and trust the flow of your life, which is the hardest thing for all of us to do. But to your point, it's like we're so constantly outward focused and feeling like we are the only ones. We're juggling everything and it's all up to us. And when we can surrender and let go and recognize that we are not the puppet masters and just let life carry us, things tend to get quieter and they tend to move. And I love all the metaphors in Betwixt of water and snow and wind and just the elements, but they really play into that, again, that sense of just let yourself be carried from one to the next and trust that you're going to end up right where you need to be. And I think that's a theme that both of these share in a really beautiful way.
Trust is really where what it all comes down to, because no life, no journey is ever going to be without fear for very obvious reasons. And we talk about how it can, if we resist change, and the fear of change, because change on its own is frightening, right? We don't get to make a change in life without part of us freaking out, because the unconscious mind is trying to just keep things safe, and anything that is unfamiliar can never be considered safe, no matter how lovely it might seem to the conscious mind, because if we haven't lived through it, we can't guarantee we can survive it. However, when we've lived through trauma and we've lived through fear and we've lived through self-doubt and self-loathing and rejection, those things we actually end up gravitating towards because they feel familiar, and therefore we know we can survive them. So we talk about the fear of making a change, and you hear this coming up constantly, feel the fear and do it anyway, and all that sort of stuff. Yes, it is frightening to make a change, but sometimes it is often it is much more uncomfortable to not make a change. And so there's this balancing act, and because you were talking about going with the flow and allowing, trusting that life will take you to good places. And I'm talking about consciously going against the flow sometimes to make sure a change happens. And these things don't really match up, except they do. It's this balancing act of recognizing when we need to consciously direct ourselves, and when we need to relax and stop trying to force something that can't happen. And the thing that makes a difference in all of this is trust, in particular self-trust. I mean, I'm not so keen on the whole trust the universe thing, just because I think it sometimes puts too much control outside of us, and we can end up being in a place where we feel at the mercy of external circumstance. Instead, I feel like it's more trusting ourselves. We can do frightening things, and we can have failures and things if we trust ourselves to be able to come through it.
And I think it's recognizing that sometimes, things like saying like let go and trust things will work out is a tricky one, because if you're attached to things have to work out a certain way or they're wrong, then that doesn't work, because you're constantly seeing evidence that you're not being taken care of and things are not safe and you can't trust yourself. But if you start to recognize that it's like that whole, you may not get what you want, but you get what you'll need. It's like my life has shown me that even when I'm the most bullheaded about something, if it's not happening, it's because it's not actually the best thing for me. And when I finally stop hitting my head against the wall and turn around and am willing to take the blinders off and see what else might be out there, that's when the flow picks up again, right? It's like, okay, because it's our own attachment and stubborn resistance that has us feeling like the world is against us, is my feeling.
I totally agree. I say it all the time, that I can't think of a situation I've been through that hasn't worked out for the best, but that is not the same as saying I can't remember a situation where I haven't got what I wanted.
Oh yeah, tons of times, constantly.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time I don't get what I thought I wanted in the first place, but if I allow it then to just go its full course, I realize that what I got in the end was what I really wanted. I just didn't know it. That's the trust. Yeah.
That's the trust. Yeah, 100%. Well, this has been so great, Hazel. I love every time I get to sit down and talk with you and just share ideas. I feel like we could probably talk for 5 hours about these things, but we won't. So just wanted to remind everyone before we sign off here. So October 15th, 6 p.m. British Standard Time, which is 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where I am in the US. Jump on the Discord server. Hazel and I are going to be talking more about these concepts, and a week ahead of the event, we're going to provide a private watch link for anyone to watch my film Ingress ahead of this discussion. So hopefully you can watch the film, play the game, and then come join us to talk a little bit more in depth about these concepts.
Yeah, we'll put a link for the Discord server in the show notes, along with any places that you can screen. In the meantime, if you're in the US, you can already screen the movie. We'll also put a link so you can play Betwixt, of course. And in the actual workshop, we'll be going a little deeper into some of the stuff we've been talking about here today, in particular, the kind of this idea of parallel universes and taking control of the tunnel we're in, choosing our love tunnels, and also how to develop and build this important kind of trust that we're talking about. So I really think that is the root of all of it. So that's what we're going to be doing in the workshop. If you're going to come along, please do just bring a pen and some paper. That's all you need. Yeah, that's that. I'll see you there.
Look forward to it.